People really want empathic and emphatic witness. Like, they want to know when somebody sees them,
Yeah.
right? If people feel tending to, then it's a little bit easier to make that transition.
Right.
But if you don't have the resources and the support and the acknowledgement, it's going to be hard to come up out of that.
Right.
Even when it looks like people do.
Hi, thank you for joining yet another episode of Get Set with Lissette. This is where we have inspiring conversations that empower you to get set. And today is yet another one of those episodes that I believe are going to have inspiration for you, impact, and also help you work through a topic that at times a lot of us tend to shy away from speaking on. So today I am joined with Julia Mallory. Julia is a published author, poet, facilitator, and grief worker. She is the founder of the Creative Container Black Mermaids and Harrisburg Youth Arts Incubator. She also opened 1006, a community cultural gathering space that centers connection, creativity, and curiosity. She was a 2023 Diaspora Solidarities Lab Community Fellow and a spring 2022 Reclamation Ventures Impact Grantor for healing practices for grief. So if you can't tell by now, we will be discussing the concept and the idea around grief and then also life after it. So thank you so much, Julia, for joining me on today's conversation. How are you?
Hey, Lissette, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Well, one of the things that I always do at the beginning, just to kind of get the jitters out, because I want to make sure that we're having an honest conversation, that this is just feeling authentic, true, and, just getting out those unnecessary things. I always do like a this or that. Don't overthink it. Just a very quick this or that. Are you sweet or salty?
Salty.
Okay. My kind of girl. Morning person or night owl?
I'm going to say night owl.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, I can get up early when I need to,
Right.
get my day going, but I think I'm a person that would much rather stay up later.
Okay. Okay. Introvert or extrovert?
Extrovert.
I could see that. All right. And this one, there is literally no wrong answer. Are we going to watch the YouTube or listen to the podcast?
I'm a listener.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you'll be listening to the audio. Not mad at it at all. Okay. So how you feeling?
I feel good.
You feel good? All right. So in preparation for today's topic in particular, I really wanted to get some stats around it as well and provide some information concerning the topic, and not just the topic, but like the actual impact and the effects that grief has on individuals. So I'm going to kind of go over a few of these stats and then tell me if you feel like these are surprising or you're like, that's not surprising to me and I know this. So a 2021 study by the American Psychiatric Association found that PGD, also known as prolonged grief disorder, is associated with increased risk of depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders, with many individuals requiring specialized grief-focused therapy. Also, a 2012 study published in Circulation revealed that the risk of a heart attack increases by 21-fold in the first 24 hours following the death of a loved one and remains significantly elevated for up to about a month. Chronic grief is associated with increased blood pressure, stress hormones, and heart rate. And I got that from Harvard Medical School and the Heartbreak of Grief study from 2012. And then in 2020, there was a study by the Grief Recovery Institute, which reported that unresolved grief costs, so now we're going to talk about the actual amount, cost the U.S. economy over $75 billion, with a B, billion dollars annually, due to loss of productivity, absenteeism, and workplace errors. Employees dealing with grief report reduced engagement and focus, with over 85% stating they felt unsupported at work. And then the last one, and this one is child specifically, because I thought I would find, how grief actually impacts kids as well. So according to the Judi's House Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model from 2022, 1 in 13 children in the U.S. will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. And then it says grieving children are at 1.9 times greater risk of also then developing depression, anxiety, and more likely to have poor academic performance without the appropriate support.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about some of these stats?
Okay, so it's a lot of stats,
Right?
right?
Yeah,
a
that's
lot of
why I was like,
stats,
a little bit of everything.
but I think, where do I want to start? So I think I'll start with my own grief journey,
Yeah.
the most recognizable thing in there, which is, I would say the last stat being about children who lose their parents before the age of 18.
Yeah.
Because I also fall into that category.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So I lost my dad when I was 13 years old.
Okay.
And so now in hindsight, I recognize all the additional support and resources that I could have benefited from.
Okay.
But did not know how to articulate that, or there wasn't like this plethora of opportunity to connect with those type of resources.
There.
And so I think what I also, speaking of the word resources, what I want to highlight is like a through line that I recognize in when we talk about prolonged grief, or we talk about unresolved grief.
Yeah.
Couple of nuances there. Not all grief can be resolved, right?
Wow.
Not all grief can be resolved, but also I think we live in a grief avoidant society. So
that's it right there.
So people are already coming into an environment where it's very uncomfortable for people to acknowledge the loss. And especially when it's inconvenient to our social order or the way we do things, right? And so I will say that study from the American Psychiatric Association that talked about prolonged grief, there was a lot of pushback that came out with the discussion of prolonged grief disorder, because ultimately calling prolonged grief disorder is pathologizing grief.
Okay.
Right.
Yes. Can explain what that means.
Absolutely.
You just hit a nail right there. So to explain that in greater detail.
So basically, if we create a disorder to say that someone has prolonged grief disorder, one, grief is a natural thing, right? Loss is a natural part of life, but the thing is, it gets complicated depending on the circumstances surrounding that loss.
Absolutely.
Right? None of us are leaving this world alive.
Right. 100%. Exactly.
But are there premature deaths? Are there deaths that are very complicated and preventable, and all these different things?
Right.
So then to put people in a position to just feel like they should just get over it, especially when they're absolutely under-resourced.
Right.
Whether it's access to healing modalities such as therapy, or all other types of things that people can do to heal.
Right.
Even the idea, like, the United States does not have, we don't have mandated paid time off. Right? We don't have universal paid time off.
Right.
Even for parents that give birth. Right? We don't have that. So most jobs are like, oh, we can give you 3 days of bereavement time for an immediate family member.
I've always found that interesting because, like you said, and even immediate, how do we define such a, this relationship matters more because it's this versus another relationship? And how can we confound what immediate means to us? Because family dynamics can look very different for different, people.
Absolutely. So I had a job, it was like, oh, we had lost my cousin very unexpectedly at the end of 2021.
Wow.
And, this is to just kind of to say to them oh, yes, this was my cousin, and they're in HR is like, oh, well, we can give you 1 day for a cousin.
Wow. Right.
And like you said, familial ties, chosen family, all these different things, to just have it reduce to a relationship that only fits within the parameters of some text and a policy book.
Right. How does that How do you define one's life, basically? And the
Right.
importance of it in these kind
So
of, like,
think about it, even an
yeah.
immediate family, right?
Mhm.
3 days. 3
Right.
days, right? You could say, "Oh, a person lost a child," and your job will give you 3 days of paid time off that you don't have to eat into your own
Your own
PTO
time,
if you even
exactly.
have that, depending on where
Right.
you work at,
Right.
right?
That
So
part.
in a society that has very little infrastructure to be able to support people who are experiencing, um, life-changing events,
Mhm.
to then now say it's a disorder because
Right.
y'all have not progressed or moved on,
Even that,
it's
you're
very
right.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And we also know some communities are hit with grief way more frequently, a specific type of grief,
Right.
um, more so than other communities.
Mhm.
So to then, again, pathologize it
That's actually a
and
very
yeah.
interesting, like, so, and in that, we got stats, but do we even care for those stats, guys? Because like you're saying, how amazing is that one can look at these things for what it is and, like, go deeper into them,
Mhm,
but you're also minimizing the actual, like, loss of a loved one, loss of, and like you said, we're now, like, reducing it to when it comes to work, how much time a person is allowed to get based upon
mhm.
the relationship, how much time is quote unquote acceptable for. So you just kind of, like, blew my mind in that, but in the best of ways. Like, that's true, because then how are we even able to do work around grief when we look at it from such a distorted viewpoint with,
Exactly.
like, that's how I'm gathering it now. Like,
And
it's,
I would encourage folks too, like, if every time you come across
yeah.
statistics or a study,
Yes, like,
you gotta dig a little bit deeper. You have to see
mhm.
who were the people that were studied, you
Mm.
know, what were even the questions that were asked,
Yeah,
right? Because sometimes the answers are simply framed by the questions that were asked. So maybe you don't see the answers that you want because the questions that you were curious about were never even proposed. So I think
absolutely.
it's very important for us when we come across statistics too
Yeah,
to just dig a little bit deeper. Um,
absolutely.
and even again, when folks do research, it's this idea of a sample size, and so we like to think that it's supposed to be representative of a larger
Of a larger,
population.
absolutely, right.
But could it be if you have also excluded certain communities too,
Ooh,
or have not absolutely brought certain communities in to
right,
engage them?
right.
So I just think whenever we come across statistics, look at them, study them, understand them, and then also ask, does this connect with what my experience or the people that I am connected to experience has been?
Right, like, does it
Mhm.
actually, whether it's mirror or have, like, an
Mhm.
ability to also, like, show X community, and how
Yeah.
does that look like? That's actually really interesting. And in that same regard, and then we're kinda gonna work backwards and come back, but this was just profound.
Mhm.
The concept that the US economy is being impacted by $75 billion, and yet, based off of the conversation we're having, had that structure just been changed and created and put into place an opportunity for real resources and
Mhm.
for real time, employees may not be, like they were saying, unfocused, unable to work, doing the
Those
things that
folks
they
that they
have.
felt unsupported,
There it
right?
is.
And so I will
Because I was just like,
I'm gonna put a
that,
little bit of historical context on this
please,
now,
that's why you're here. Yeah.
because if we're talking about grief and if
Yes.
we're talking about productivity, w we have to go a little bit further
Yes.
back in the founding of this country, where the
Mhm.
foundation is the enslaved labor of
Mhm.
kidnapped Africans, and so what does that mean? That means that there was always this kind of grief was always at odds with
Right.
productivity when it came
Mm.
to this country, and
Right.
so that
It's
really hasn't
always been.
shifted. Even though, like, time has gone on,
Right.
when you really study the history, you see that through line is consistent, right?
Right.
The so so grief is grief was something that was also seen as being Thomas Jefferson wrote something in 1787, notes, to the what is it, like, Notes to the State of Virginia, and in his observation of, the captured Black people that are on his property, he
Yeah.
basically says, their griefs are transient, like, basically, like, and he also follows that up with, the things that would make everybody else doubt whether hell or heaven was a real thing, are sooner forgotten with them,
Wow.
right? So in his observation, it was this idea that Black folks don't really feel like that. And if they do feel, they get over it really quickly.
And so he made a horrible assumption based off of what he believed he was observing.
Well, and this is the thing. I think it's more so, I don't think he believed it, to be honest. I think it's just more justification to maintain the status quo. Yeah. I don't think he absolutely believed it. I think it was just, let me say this. Also, let me write it down. So then other people will be okay with this institution persisting, because people will be like, oh, okay, then they're fine.
Right.
This ain't really bothering them. They okay.
Right.
Right. But I will say, I have done, speaking of productivity in the modern sense,
Yes.
I have done presentations talking about how to create a more grief-aware workplace.
Right. Yes.
Because I do think that companies sometimes, again, it's easy to just kind of just keep it pushing.
And look over.
And to look over.
Absolutely.
And I remember talking to this one small business consultant, and he said, well, Julia, I hear what you're saying, but if I have a company that only has but so many employees, how do I get the owner to understand that it's important for them to make sure that their staff feel supported?
Right.
And I'm like, but at the end of the day, like, you can't afford to make them feel like they don't feel supported. Right. If this is somebody who's been working with you, like, sometimes we have to create temporary measures to circumvent, this like kind of delay or disconnect of like people being able to do their jobs.
Right.
Sometimes we have to step in and step up. Right. Like, and that just is, it could be temporary.
Yeah.
Right. But imagine having an employee come back to work and feel like y'all did not have their back.
Right. Of course, that's where you get the absenteeism. Well, why am I even coming? Well, y'all don't care kind of thing. You're going to get someone who's half there because they feel lackluster. And
like, you literally didn't have my back in my worst days.
Absolutely.
Right. And I do know, but this is the problem too. Sometimes it's just like, oh, I'll often think, what can the workplace sustain? Like, what are the things that, we can ask the workplace to do?
Right.
But at the same time, if we're asking our employees to do so much too, to be in workplaces, then y'all have to give more.
Right.
Have to give more.
Well, and I think that, and this is going off, but not off, I think that we're also coming into a time and a day where we're recognizing that we're whole people. Like, we are not just, and whether you're going into a typical 9-to-5 or you're more entrepreneurial or you're in whatever like arena that you're in, like, you're a whole person. And so at all times of the day, which means that I can't turn it on or turn it off, regardless of what that is. In this context, grief in particular, to just focus on X. Like, there has to be an ability to accept people in their wholeness and create opportunity for that if you really want them to show up and give their all.
Or if the workplace can't accept you in your wholeness, then we have to make sure that we have a society that can absorb when folks, have to be provided care for. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing, that maybe work can't always do all the things.
Right.
But what's our like emotional, social, like safety net?
Correct.
Like, what is that? Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Like, what is that?
And what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. Yeah, we went, but this is important, because before I even like talk about you as a person, I appreciate the fact that even providing context and doing something to be able to show the importance of, what a learning opportunity to also say, but yet even when you look at those things and you find things that are considered like good resources, or like accredited resources, yet and still you have to understand context, and let us not ever just take things at the status quo or for what they are, but like allow the opportunity to go deeper, look further, and understand the context, because context matters.
Context matters. And like, especially when so much, like I said, so much has been written.
Right.
And people, you can frame things any old type of way to be able to hide.
Right.
I think to hide the harm that's being perpetuated.
Correct.
So I think it's on us to absolutely make sure that we're digging a little bit deeper and understanding the context of which people are creating, understanding you're reading a study.
Right.
Who are these people?
Correct.
How do what is their other body of work?
Absolutely.
Right? Does it lend itself to being someone that you want to listen to,
Right.
quite frankly.
No, 100%. No, like you said, and kudos to being able and providing individuals the ability to start to consider things from that frame and from that place because it's important. And if you don't do that, then it would be very easy for another individual who maybe does not relate to the what's being said or relate to the study in and of itself and then say, well, then maybe there's something wrong with me. And it's like, no, there's not anything wrong with you. The context really is what it is. So you're right. Let us not ever accept something for what it is.
It's so funny that you said that because that's a
Like,
perfect lead-in to talking about even very quickly
yes,
the stages of grief.
yes, all of this.
So,
Exactly.
so one of the things that when I've done like grief workshops and connections with
Mhm.
folks, we always talk about the stages of grief.
Right.
And one of the things that I always try to frame is that the stages of grief were created by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross,
Okay.
who was a social worker, and she did a study on folks I think the book came out like in 1969.
Yeah.
She did a study on people who were facing end of life mortality.
Okay.
Okay, so this is people who have been given their own diagnosis, like a
Right.
window of time to
Mhm.
live, essentially. And so ultimately, the stages of grief emerges out of that specific work.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
So in Dr. Kubler-Ross's defense, a couple of things. She says, I never meant for the stages of grief to be kind of seen as this linear progression of grief, right? I also, again, when we talk about studies,
Right.
who were the folks that she talked to? Would it look very
Right.
different if she had talked to a different group of people or a
Right.
more diverse group of people?
Right.
Right?
Right.
I think that's also important. And then in her later work,
Yeah.
she started to evolve the discussion because she also had conversations with the people, like family members and friends and associates
Absolutely.
of the people who were facing end of life mortality.
Got it.
Right?
Right.
So the initial study didn't so much as consider
Others.
others,
Right.
but as her work moved on, it did.
Okay.
But I think what's really critical is that it was never meant to be taken in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like first I'm
Right.
here, then I'm
Yeah.
here,
Right.
and then I'm here.
Right.
Right? Because sometimes people feel like a failure
When they don't fall.
when they don't fall in that linear progression, or it feels like I'm still on this stage.
Right.
And like I told people in my own personal journey, it's not you could hit all those stages in one day.
Mm.
You could have all those feelings.
Right.
I do think the stages of grief are very useful
Right.
to be able to give us some language though.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think it's very helpful to be able to even just use certain terms in discussion to grief.
Okay.
And then maybe other people see the model
Right.
and it's like, oh, now we're kind of speaking the same language.
Absolutely.
Right. So I
Yeah.
do find it very useful in that way. But definitely advise against using it as something that's like first you're here, then
Right.
you get here. Because that's not necessarily one, how she meant it, but also
Yeah.
doesn't work like that.
Do you want, and we're going left, but because you mentioned it, do you want to even like quickly for context and for individuals to know, like discuss like what those stages were, like, because I know that they're very popular and people tend to know like these are the quote unquote stages of grief. Not that it matters and not that that's necessarily something you have to like follow, but do you want to just mention for context, like these are what are known as this?
So to be honest, like my memory recall is not that strong.
that's
so
fine.
I
That
can't,
sounds like
I'm
you
like,
know
ooh, I don't think I could hit the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
But that's why I was like, I didn't know if you wanted to like provide some some information because I mean, I know that that's like a popular thing and people always talk about that, like, how
No, that was very easy for folks to Google. They could definitely find that.
but like you said, how important is it even in the midst of that to not focus on or get so stuck in I'm supposed to do this in this linear aspect, or you know what, I'm already in like the anger stage. I didn't go through denial or I didn't go through this. Like I'm straight at angry and I skipped 1 and 2 kind of, you know what I mean? Like it allows for individuals to know whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Like stay present and for what, like whatever you feel, it's what you feel. So it's right. Like, I don't know. I guess I'm just saying like individuals need to understand that it doesn't matter what stage it is. And like she said, you can find it, you can look for it. But just understand that there is language out there for you.
Well, and I think with the stages too, I think it is very I think I lost my train of thought. But
You're fine.
But yeah, I think the stages, like, that's something that's available online.
Yep.
But when we talked about context, because I think most people that I had encountered, they knew the stages, but no one had dug a little bit deeper.
Fair.
Um,
Fair.
but I get it. I'm not even trying to be dismissive because I
Fair.
totally understand.
Right.
Like, we see something, it sounds official,
Right.
and we're just like, "Oh, okay, this is a thing. How
That's
does it
real.
apply to me?"
Yeah.
And so now I think we do have to get to a place sometimes where we're just like, okay, let me just do a little bit more.
Mhm.
Let me just dig
Yeah.
a little bit more and see what the context is.
Right.
What's the origin story of this thing that I am accepting?
So but this conversation is just giving me life. Can I ask, what got you to a point that allowed you to start thinking in the manner which you did? Like, when did you start to say, no, I don't accept that. What's the origin? Like, at what point did you say, what's the origin of this? Like,
So in 2017,
yes.
I lost my oldest son, Julian, to gun violence. Julian was 17 years old at the time. He had just turned 17. And I mean, needless to say, it was like the hardest thing that I had
I
ever
can imagine.
experienced,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there was this window of time because, I've grown up in an environment where child loss is not, it should be more rare,
I agree.
right? It should be more rare. Um, and so I thought about like all the grieving like Black women that I had known before myself.
Yeah.
And I was also just trying to think, like, what did I feel like I needed in that moment?
Mm.
And there was a window of time that I felt like I couldn't be passive in healing through grief.
Understood.
And I say healing through grief because I don't think we heal from grief,
Right. You're just
right? Grief is always with us,
there. Yeah.
right?
For as long as there's a loss, which is forever, there
Right.
will always be grief.
There will always be grief. And so I just saw there was like this glimpse of, to be quite frank, like me not making it, me not surviving
Yeah.
if I was not intentional about trying to heal through this loss.
Understood. I cannot. Yeah.
And so I basically was just like, oh, okay, I have to be proactive.
Right.
I have to be proactive.
Absolutely.
And that looked like doing several things, like making sure that, because sometimes it's easy when people kind of experience this type of loss to also make everyone else around us comfortable.
Mm.
And there were certain things that I just resisted against.
That right there hit me, but you're right about that. But okay, so when you said there were certain things you resisted.
Yeah, so that was one of them, and I think just getting very intentional.
Yeah.
About how do I heal through this loss. And so part of that is obviously like, okay, there's certain things you do, like, okay, I'm doing therapy, or what other type of resources are out there?
Right.
What else can I read?
Right.
And then in the process of doing that, the other thing, because I'm usually like a more private person with my personal life.
Same. Yeah.
But there was like this thing on my spirit that was just like, you're supposed to talk openly and honestly about this experience with the loss of your son.
Okay.
And so even that, and it wasn't to be like a grief guru or anything like that. It was just like, oh, I'm supposed to just share with folks how I'm feeling, what's working. Oh no, I'm not okay today.
Right.
Like, and as the more I think as I also expressed that,
Right.
I was able to also find some sort of relief.
Right.
But there were also times when I knew that I could not have relief. You know?
Yeah.
Like there were times when I knew that, yeah, yo, I'm not gonna be okay in this moment. And that's okay too. Right? So I think that led me, and ultimately as a writer and a poet and an essayist.
You're already writing and doing all these things.
Yes.
Yeah.
At some point I realized like, okay, I'm gonna write a book about this experience. And so then that led me to doing more deep research because I wanted to frame it.
Right.
I wanted to put some context around it.
Absolutely. Like we tend to do.
Right. I want to talk about my own personal journey, but I know that like my grief was not exceptional, right? It was not
Understood. The fact that you say
uncommon.
that kills me, but you're
Right,
not wrong.
right.
And that's so sad.
So the first version of the book, I have a book, Survivor's Guilt, that
Yes.
crystallizes like a 2-year time period,
Okay.
from losing Julian to after.
Mhm.
But then in so the book came out in like the end of October 2019.
Okay.
And we had a really, really great book release
Yeah.
and, having these conversations.
Right.
And then a few months later, we're in the midst of global loss with the pandemic.
Correct.
And I realized that there was even more context because even the way that people were framing people dying, right? At first, it was we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they did a calculus and they said, oh, it's more Black and brown and more poor communities, more folks are dying.
Right.
Then it became, oh, y'all need to be personal. You need to be more responsible for your health, right? That became the messaging.
Right.
And so that didn't sit well with me. It's like it didn't sit well with a lot of people,
Right. Right.
And so I started doing more research and I was like, oh, I'm going to release another version of Survivor's Guilt
Okay.
because I think there is something again about talking about productivity, right? Because a lot of people, the thing was that we have certain communities, Black and brown folk, who have jobs that can't be performed from home.
Right.
These so-called essential workers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Who are not been adequately provided for and resourced to survive this pandemic,
Right.
right?
Right.
So if their productivity is at odds with their own ability to care for themselves, then what's going to be the narrative? The narrative is going to be anything that makes them feel ashamed
Right.
because they are not being productive,
Right.
right, on behalf of this labor
Right.
system. So
Right.
once those type of things started hitting me and I started doing more research and I'm
Right.
finding this Thomas Jefferson quote and
Yeah.
all these different things, I'm like, oh,
And you're realizing it goes
it's deeper than
goes
this.
deep. Right.
It's been an ongoing perpetuation.
Right.
So
That's amazing.
that's how I kind of ended
Right.
up here.
Right.
And so doing the community grief work was just from an organic place of just saying, hey, folk, can we just talk about grief?
Okay.
Right?
So,
Like very ordinary.
yeah. Can we just have a conversation?
Can we just have a conversation? And then that kind of evolved to doing more connections and collaborations with certain community groups and organizations.
Okay.
And then the writing piece,
Yeah.
for me, that's an ongoing project of
Right.
understanding
Okay.
just how pervasive these things
These
are.
I was gonna ask, so I'm way off, but I'm loving where we're headed instead. Because you said, as you continue to do research and you realize how far it went and how
Mhm.
deep it went, and you then from there were like, can we just have a conversation? At what point, and if you can't pinpoint it, that's fine, but like, at what point did you realize, like, we see the gap based off of the research. So the
Mhm.
gap was present because you can see there's a huge like disconnect between communities, and whether it's loss of productivity, whether at the time you're mentioning COVID and prior to the COVID thing, like you were actually searching when it came to like grief and loss in and of itself. At what point did you realize outside of just can we just have a conversation, did it change into like, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is like one of your like best areas and like your most versed, and like I feel like you're doing more than just having conversation though. Like at what point did it become I'm really going to be a change maker? Like I'm being called to do even more than just that. Like how did that progression happen, and how did you respond accordingly and say yes, I'm willing to like take this charge now? I know I hit you with a lot.
No. I think
It's just,
it's interesting because I don't always feel like that.
girl, that's what
You
it
know?
is.
I don't always feel like that. I just kind of feel like I'm a person that, because I'm also a person that's like perpetually curious myself. So I'm
Fair.
always studying, I'm always reading, I'm always learning.
Okay.
And so the opportunity to come and then share what I've learned
Right.
with other folks, it just seems so like natural, like a natural
Okay.
extension.
Understood.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to minimize that
I
it's
was
a
gonna
certain
say,
type of labor. Like,
yeah.
I'm not trying to minimize it, but I do think I don't know if there was a defining point as opposed to
Right.
just just keep talking, just
And
keep
just
working. Yeah, I don't know if there was like a defining point.
right.
Just like, oh, I'm doing this, and then
Right. You just feel like it just kept
you know, and actually, let me say maybe a more so catalyst. I think I
Yeah.
can pinpoint
Okay.
when it just was like, oh, I think I'm gonna do something more
Yes.
intentional
Yes.
here beyond because I had already written the book. So what happened was like in that I would say was still like probably maybe mid
Mhm.
to late March
Okay.
or maybe early April.
Okay.
I think it was early April 2020.
Got it. Okay.
So I was partnering with Hospice of Central PA,
Okay.
and we were supposed to do like they wanted me to come and do because one of the people that worked for them had I had connected with her around the grief work, and
Yeah.
she's a social worker, and she had come to the book release
Yeah.
event, and she wanted me to kind of create a similar experience in community, but with partnering with Hospice of Central PA.
Okay. Understood.
So when we were supposed to do a book event with them, there's supposed to be like
Okay.
this conversation. There's supposed to be
Mm.
me kind of doing a reading, and then maybe having some like community connection and conversation around laws.
Okay.
Well, needless to say, that was scheduled for April 2020.
Okay.
Needless to say, with the pandemic happening, that got canceled.
Fair. Right.
But the moment that I would pinpoint where I felt like beyond just my own individual post, so to speak,
Right.
maybe let's kind of do something a little bit more like bring other folks in
Right.
an
Yeah.
intentional way. There was an article that was going around that talked about anticipatory grief.
Anticipatory grief.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's kind of like the easier way to say it is waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right. Basically.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
You're
basically
anticipating something bad to happen. Kind of
exactly. So
thing.
a lot of
Right.
people know that feeling like,
Yeah.
I just feel like something about to
Something's
happen
gonna
or,
happen.
you know.
Yeah.
So that's anticipatory grief.
Okay.
Right. And so when I saw that article, but it wasn't just me seeing the article, it was that I saw a lot of my Facebook friends were sharing this article.
Okay.
And when I saw that, I made a post and said, hey, y'all, will folks be willing to, like, would it be helpful if I did like some sort of like workshop or some sort of conversation
Okay.
around grief in this?
Like
And
this new topic.
overall resounding yes. People were very interested.
Okay.
And then that's when I was like, okay. I put together some materials,
Mhm.
and I'm pretty sure it was like at the end of March, or not the end of March. It was like sometime like early April
Got it.
when I had the first one.
Okay.
So I would say that was probably, if I had to pinpoint where I shifted from
Right.
kind of just more like an individualized perspective
Absolutely.
in my own individual journey
Yes.
to something that was more collective and community specific, that
Okay.
would be the time.
So, do you think, and tell me what your thoughts are, that you are being led in your work? Like, because I know you said that you felt a resounding, like, you felt the need to talk about your experience. And then by nature, you are inquisitive and you are a writer
Mhm.
by like you are like a published 6+ books kind of individual.
Mhm.
So of course writing comes in. Do you feel like life is almost leading you down the path that you're supposed to like go in because you're seeing these things and now you found an opportunity to respond? Like, is that what's happening? Do you feel like this is just naturally coming to you, or are you actively now like pursuant of?
To be honest, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I have a lot of things that
Mhm.
I'm interested in that I feel
Yeah.
called to do, quite
Yeah.
honestly.
Okay.
And I'm a person too that my grief work, a lot of people know me for my grief work for sure.
Right.
And it fits in with other offerings
Fair.
that I think
Yeah.
I like to pursue or share with others.
Yeah.
But I will say, being more grief aware,
Mm.
I do wear that lens is open,
It's
like in like most of the things that I do. It's like once you kind of,
right.
it's like most basic example. It's like once you like say like, somebody got like a red car or
Right.
like, and then now you start seeing the red, it's like,
Right,
oh,
right,
I feel like
idea.
I never saw that model car before until you got it. And now you notice it all the time.
Understood.
So I think that's what like our consciousness, once our eyes get open, so to speak,
Then
you kind of just notice this through line
Okay.
in the work. So
then let's talk on that, because I know where clearly grief is where a lot of our time and our conversation has gone in.
mhm.
But I would be remiss if I didn't just give you your flowers in real time and allow you the ability to talk about everything that you've been able to accomplish.
Mhm.
And you even said at one point, and the reason why you ended up doing the work is because in the midst of your own tragedy and your own loss, you realized that I got to a point where I didn't even know if I could keep going, right?
Mhm.
You found the ability to keep going, and not only keep going, but thrive.
Mhm.
Like, A, where do you get that strength from, and how do you kind of tap into it? And then B, let's talk about how you've created a multitude of opportunities and business ventures, and everything, in my opinion, is community based. And so it seems as though you just have a heart of giving back that then continues to come back. Like,
Mhm.
when did those shifts happen? And then, like, let's talk about all the things that you do, because you're right, I don't want it to just be that all you do is grief work. I want you to talk about everything, but it does feel like the foundation of like allowing you to become a catalyst of just community because of it.
So I think my foundation, to be quite honest, in this community as a person, like as an artist or a poet, um, I had been a performing poet in this community for like 20 years.
Right.
So a lot of people know me from that,
From
to
your
be quite
poetry.
honest, like
Yeah.
in going into schools and talking to young people and
Yeah.
people of all ages, quite honestly,
Yeah.
and performing in the city.
Okay.
So that is where a lot of, I think, my public connections started.
Got it.
And even just wanting to be, because the one thing that does feel more natural to me is I feel like I'm a natural teacher.
Okay.
I'm a child who liked to play school.
Yeah.
So
I understand.
that has
Okay.
always been the through line for
Yeah,
me.
yeah,
So
that's
even in like when I was doing poetry and things with young people, like always trying to like how do we grow and how do we grow our craft, right? And how do we understand even the literary foundations that we're standing on.
Right.
That was something that was always important to me.
Okay.
With regards to, I think, so just to check back in with that question.
Yes. Yes.
You're asking me, tell me what you're asking me again.
Yeah. So I'm asking you, A, where you garner the strength to pull out of that dark space, right? And find like your, whether it's your light post, your silver lining,
Yeah,
like,
got you.
right?
Okay.
And then B, then start talking about what you've been able to create.
Okay. So thank you.
You're welcome. Lori.
So
Yes.
strength is such an interesting concept.
Mm.
And here's why. If I frame it in connection and conversation with grief,
Okay.
couple things I want to say. So when I was younger, I didn't have a good understanding of grief. I didn't understand just certain things. Being a young person, I don't know if and then you also kind of take cues from the environment, right? A lot of people that, persistent, just kind of moving on. I also just thought it was like really rude or weird to talk to people about their loss. But as I got older, I understood that most people want to be seen in their time of despair.
Right.
Most people, I think society, sometimes I think we get a little confused. We think that like, oh, these people just want all this attention.
Right.
But I think that what it is people want our intention, right? I think people...
Can you talk on that, girl? You
Mhm.
drop gems. People want our intention. Keep going. I'm
Yeah,
sure that was a wonderful.
people want our intention. I think that
Yes.
people want to know that they are seen in their time of despair. I think people want to know that they somebody got their back.
Right.
And also when you lose people, because I know I've read different perspectives on grief where people say they grew up in environments where once that person died, like nobody ever talked about them again. Right? Like the names just didn't get mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think about like, families where a sibling dies and like they just kind of don't even mention that child's name no more,
Yeah.
or really acknowledge that that child had lived. And
Right.
so I say that to say that I know that now people really want empathic and emphatic witness. Like, they want to know that somebody sees them,
Yeah.
right? And I'm like, oh, if people feel tending to,
Mm-hmm.
then it's a little bit easier to make that transition.
Right.
But if you don't have the resources and the support and the acknowledgement,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be hard to come up out of that,
Right.
even when it looks like people do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we don't necessarily care about people like healing.
Right.
We are just happy that they're no longer making us uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Like,
Mm.
oh, you feel better. Oh, good. Now I feel like I don't have to be like walking on eggshells, kind of.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we are framing our discomfort,
Right.
right? Like, so that's why I also try to tell people, I'm not taking grief and emotional awareness advice from people who demonstrate none.
Mm-hmm.
And my cousin used to always say, consider the source.
Right. Okay.
You know, my cousin Maxine used to always say, consider the source. And I think sometimes we are just listening to folk who have demonstrated none of the things that we're
Right.
trying to do.
Right.
We don't know their origin story, right?
Ooh.
We don't know the backstory on their statistics.
Right.
And we just taking it without no context.
Girl.
So I say that to say,
Yeah. And you just said a lot, but in the best of ways.
yeah, no.
Keep
So
going.
I'm saying that to say that I think once I grew, once I grew on my own grief journey,
Yeah.
I started to understand and recognize these things.
Right.
And I can also acknowledge there was a time that I did not understand these things.
Right.
And I probably was not I probably was not handling folks that were grieving in the best way.
In the best ways, right.
Right? Because I just really did not understand.
Right.
Like, I know there's some things you're supposed to do, but just like, oh, like folks also need these other things too.
Or even just creating space where they can. Like,
Yes.
yeah.
So I say that to say that, like, oh, once I realized that, that's what I'm saying, the idea of strength.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we think of strength as just people just being able to endure.
Right.
And so that's why I was like, oh, we see people who have endured a lot. Like, oh my God, you're so strong.
So strong.
And in Survivor's Guide, I talk about this because I'm like, that's such an interesting concept. Because if I went outside right now and try to lift a 10,000-pound car or something,
Right.
y'all wouldn't think I was strong. Y'all would think I was being foolish, right? So the fact that we leave folks to lift these burdens by themselves and then call them strong, like, and call that strength, no.
Ooh.
That's not what that is.
Right.
Right. So sometimes just because people survive, that don't mean that they, like, I don't think that's like
that doesn't
strength in
necessarily mean
sense.
that that's strength for what the quote unquote definition is.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Yes.
So I think sometimes we also like to bestow that accolade upon people because then it's just like, oh, she's strong. She don't need no help.
She doesn't need help, so I don't have to worry about putting myself in a position to be uncomfortable and actually show up.
Exactly. So that's why I remember, you probably remember, there's so many phases that we go through on social media with different language. And so remember, like, the whole check on your strong friend.
Yep.
Things that are happening.
Yeah.
And so what I also say too, for a lot of us, okay, strong friend. And when folks check on you, you have to be willing to be honest, right? You have to be willing to shift the so-called dynamic of you thinking you're the strong friend, right? And also, strong friend, if you really growing, you really bold, you also are reaching out to folk and letting them know, you know, I'm not doing so well.
So good.
Yeah.
Girl,
That's a whole nother level.
I was gonna say.
And that takes time and that takes practice. And I'm not like trying to shame anybody, because I also, you know, when I talk to people and we have these real conversations, I was just doing a talk about this around the holidays.
Okay.
And
Oh, yeah, because we just,
yeah, so just was gonna talk about this around the holidays with NCBW, and part of the conversation came up, and folk were just like, "Okay, Julie, but what am I supposed to say? Like,
Right.
okay, walk me through this, right?"
Right, yeah, like,
And
idea of
and some people, and I understood because some people were also saying, "But Julie, I feel like I hear you, but sometimes when I've asked people for help, they couldn't help me." And I say, "Well, that's kinda also life. Like, people can't always
always.
help us.
Right.
It's like we can't always help people.
Absolutely. Correct.
So it doesn't mean that it's, like, not you that doesn't mean it's useless.
Correct.
Um, but I also had learned I had like, family situation at one point where it hit me. It was like, "Oh, the reason too," like, it became so high stakes.
Okay.
This idea of thinking, "Oh, I don't ever ask nobody for nothing, so when I ask you that one time, y'all should be ready." So, it was too high stakes.
I get that, and that is a horrible way
It's a horrible thing.
but I have been guilty of.
Oh, who hasn't?
I'm like,
It's so
I
common.
can
But
definitely
you know what
say,
happened? What I realized, I was like, "Oh, girl, ain't nobody had no training.
ooh,
Ain't nobody had no training. Nobody had been prepared to
prepared.
spring into action because you was never asking for anything." So
Right.
even though we think that people will be like, "Oh, she'll never ask me for nothing. Let me spring into action." I don't know if people always know that you asking them now feels like an extreme sport for you. So they're like, "Oh, okay, she's probably fine."
Right, right.
She
Yeah.
used to having it anyway, so if I don't, she'll be
It's not gonna
fine.
be right, yeah.
And then also people really just practice.
Mm.
I mean, practice does matter, right? We get better when we practice at things.
Right, right.
So even caregiving and taking care of kids and taking care of each other,
Yes.
you meet people, you learn them, and then you're like, "Oh, okay, I know I would never bring her this dish because when she's sad, she likes to eat X, Y, or
Right,
whatever."
right.
So again, practice.
Girl.
But if we are not practice, because even I was laughing, the one of the older ladies in the group said, "Well, Julia, yeah, but I hear you, but I want my things done a certain kind of way." And then I said, "Well,
You gotta
sometimes you just gonna have it's just gonna be done.
right,
Do you want the help or not?"
right, 'cause
But
you can't also
also,
dictate.
if people were coming,
Yeah.
then maybe over time they'll learn how to do it how you like it.
Also
But they're
fair.
not gonna be able to probably show up first time,
Right,
having never been asked or done it, and just do it 100% the way that you want it.
right. So, but we have to learn. So you make an interesting point because we say practice makes perfect in sports, in all other arenas of life. But when it comes to actually like being supportive, or when it comes to actually showing up, or when it comes to like being there for X, like for X
Mhm.
person, I think that you make a good point that we forget that that also takes practice. Like, you have to learn your partner. Like, that's the concept of, like, when you're dating, you learn the person, you learn what they like and don't like. You learn how things are supposed to be. You practice, "Oh, they like this dish more than the other dish. They like this or that." Like, you learn those things. So why do we not do this in real time, in real life, when it comes to just showing up for people?
I think we do have it's so funny because you mentioned, like, partner, so I'm thinking, like, romantic love, and I
Right,
do
but
think we have these kind of ideas that, um I think sometimes we have an idea that when it's right, things will just happen as opposed to we grow into making things perfect for ourselves.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, it takes communication, it takes vulnerability because I had to learn that. Like,
Yeah.
I had to learn that it wasn't just gonna be like a magical fantasy without my communication, without my input,
Right.
without my vulnerability saying, "Thank you, and I like this.
Right.
Thank you. My preference is to have
Right.
this."
Right.
And that is, like, you have to grow into that.
Yeah.
And
Like
the same thing with relationships regardless, right? So not even just prioritizing or
mm,
centering romantic love, but
right.
in our, chosen family, in our community, like being able to learn each other. But you gotta be curious too.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Sometimes we're in a relationship with people that I don't know if they're even curious about us. And that's another thing. That's a whole nother
I
thing.
would say that's a whole nother topic. But in arenas of all of that, now I want you to go ahead and do your thing and talk about like all the things that you do. Like who is Julia today? And
Mhm.
like what do you have going on? Because we've talked about your journey. We've talked about the work that you're doing. We spent a lot of time talking about grief because the reality is that this conversation is a lot around life after
Mhm.
loss, life after. But I also want to have the opportunity to then explain, and you're soaring, my dear. And like, what have you now done? Like, what have you accomplished?
So
All the things.
yeah, so I'm from Harrisburg, the
Right.
city, born and raised. I had
Yep.
all city schools. I would say I'm a first generation Harrisburgian. Neither of my parents were from here. They migrated here in the 70s.
Okay.
And you know, Harrisburg it's just interesting,
Girl.
um I've grown up a lot
Yeah.
here. I've grown a lot here. Um and a lot of this new journey for me started
Yeah.
when I published my first collection of poetry, Black Mermaids,
Yep. Black Mermaid.
in November 2016.
Yeah.
And that book had been several years in the making.
Okay.
Um and when it came out, it was like a portal of opportunity just opened up. It like shifted something.
Okay.
And then that book came out in November 2016. And then because they saw Black Mermaids, like they were thinking it was something child related. Even though the cover wasn't illustrated in that way.
I was gonna say
But sometimes people
yeah.
think of, mermaids being related to child interests or young people interests. And I was like, oh, I was talking to a friend about it, and she was like, I think you should just write it. Because I was like, oh, I got to do something else.
Right.
Like I automatically felt responsible to bring some type of other creative offering to maybe like preteens, younger people.
Okay.
And because I remember one person in particular was like, Julia, my daughter is 10, would she be able to read Black Mermaids? And I was like, she could read it, but I don't know if it is appropriate for a 10-year-old necessarily.
Yeah, because there's some pieces in there.
Yeah, there's some pieces in there.
Yeah.
Or just even, again, depending on the 10-year-old, because I definitely was reading stuff like that at 10. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but
get it.
that's a good or bad thing.
Understood. Same.
So long story short, talking to my homegirl, she's like, I think you should just write a children's book.
Okay.
And I was like, that's so crazy. Why did I never even think of writing a children's book?
Right.
Because I'm a person that like loved to read as a kid. I still love children's books. So that next month, I sat down and wrote a children's book, Karina and the Black Mermaid.
Correct.
And that book was supposed to come out in the summer of the spring of 2017.
Correct.
I mean, yeah, we were trying to get it out 2017. And everything with Julian happened at the end of May and into June.
Exactly.
And so at that time, you mentioned earlier in the interview, like, yes, I felt like at that moment, none of this matters.
Right.
Am I even going to be able to go on?
Right.
It felt very strange.
Right.
To still be like, okay, yes, I'm going to put books out in the world and do all this stuff.
Right.
So I needed some time. I needed some time to process.
Yes.
What was the difference between me healing through my grief and expanding my creativity, as opposed to using my creativity as a distraction from the intentional healing work?
Okay.
So I needed some time to process that.
Absolutely.
And so obviously I found my stride.
Yeah.
But even during the pandemic, having a lot of time, being in social isolation, I realized that even still I probably moved on, like I was moving maybe a little faster.
Okay.
So then 2020 really gave me some more introspective time.
Okay.
Which I also still feel like healing happens in stages too.
Yeah.
Because I don't think our nervous system could handle all that.
Okay.
So sometimes I think we gotta be like, okay. It's like when you it's like you're just doing multiple sprints. It's like, okay, okay, let me take a breath.
Right.
Let me take a breath.
Absolutely.
That's how it feels. So, I mean, my work has, it has expanded into visual art.
Yeah.
So, I'm a abstract painter. I'm also a collage artist, experimental filmmaker.
Yes.
This work has just continued to grow, and then now I'm really trying to build something for community connection and creativity at 1006.
At 1006.
Mm-hmm.
So from what it sounds like, your first medium, like you're just a creative at heart, like from the beginning. Starts with Black Mermaids because you were already as a poet, correct?
Yes,
as a poet, getting things going. And as like, am I wrong or am I not wrong? Was that your first complete work of art that was published, or had you already published?
No, Black Mermaids was the first.
I thought so. Okay,
yes.
so that's your first, and then from there, whether life gave you a left with the grief and then that's become another you have found a way, and please, I don't want to like bring it down, but a way to, through whatever happens to you within life, find an opportunity to sit with, learn from, go in first, and then find an opportunity to make it serve and be a medium for outlets for others as well, and everything you do, survivor's guilt, going through your own journey, but finding an opportunity to actually help, the ability to continue to write in your works, like things that are going to then, it started within, and now you found an ability to also like, this is what I've learned, this is what's helped, this is what I've garnered. If it's a blessing, great, but you're finding opportunities to get your creativity out. And rather than it be a distraction that you thought it could be, it seems as though, and please, I'm just paraphrasing everything I'm hearing, it seems as though you've used it as a medium for the next thing and continue to push you through. Because now with 1006, you're actually going even further out and creating a space for community.
So I will say this is where it gets a little complicated in talking about,
because it's a lot.
Yeah, I think this is where it gets a little complicated for me. I try to always like balance out this distinction.
Yes.
I think it is my healing work that has allowed me to unearth certain layers of creativity.
Okay.
Because sometimes I think that we all, like, it's an automatic assumption that when people have difficult things,
right,
then it's like, oh, if you just use it,
like it's your power kind of.
Right. And I think I don't want to speak for other artists.
Okay.
And I don't think I have the definitive voice on this.
Okay.
So I want to be very careful too, and not acting like my perspective is the only one that matters here.
Fair.
But I do think that it is the healing work that allows the work to keep from consuming us. Because I think that sometimes the thought, like I said, is that when people go through something difficult, that is automatically useful.
Okay.
That is automatically like, if I just bring that out,
right,
then that is a thing that demonstrates that I've healed or I've moved through it.
Got it. Fair.
And I think that sometimes if we've not found a safe space to be able to connect with like whatever the healing looks like for us, that the work comes out, and the mirror it might hold up to us, if we're not well, it may be too much.
Right.
Like it may not just be this thing that is like, I know this is getting a little esoteric, but I think there is something about like working through it, healing through it, allows us to be able to face the content that comes up out of the experience.
Ooh.
And if we have not done that.
Got it.
And I remember somebody saying this to me. They were like, oh, they had a very difficult, experience and journey with personal tragedy. And they were saying that, their immediate reaction, which a lot of people do, is they want to get out there and just be a servant to other people,
others,
and tell their story. And the testimony is supposed to be like the healing thing for everybody.
Right.
And she was like, I couldn't understand why, one, I was never feeling good after the experience, but also why it really wasn't landing or hitting. And then she was like, I came across your work and your approach and understood, because I was not just talking about the thing in a public sphere was not healing in itself.
Not healing it. Right.
Right. And so when she was like, okay, so I realized I needed to go back more inside. I need to do more work.
Absolutely.
And then once I had a better handle on it, then I realized like, oh, yes, now I am actually ready.
Right.
To be an example, to be in community, to be in connection.
Got it.
Around a specific type of testimony.
Understood.
So that's just been my experience.
Right. And the ability to first go in.
Yeah, no. And sometimes when people were going through difficult things, like the beautiful work that we create, sometimes I was just reading, there's a filmmaker, David Lynch, who just passed away, and he was talking about the artist Van Gogh, and in the quote, he said something to the effect of, you know, that it was like, it wasn't necessarily, I guess, like, the work was not healing but basically the paintings, like, the paintings that came out
Right.
were that was the extent of what he could access.
Okay.
Like, that was the extent of what was available to him,
Got
in
it.
spite of everything else,
Okay.
right? So, using my perspective is like, "Oh, then the paintings themselves are not healing, but
Right.
sometimes that is what people still have available to them
This is the only
in
thing
the
he had
tragedy, as
through
opposed
it.
to people always putting that banner on there like, "Oh, this work is healing,"
Right. Yeah.
or "You're healed because you were able to produce that work."
Correct.
And it's
Right.
like, no, sometimes that's all I could bring through
Okay.
despite what I'm
And
experiencing.
regardless of, right, like,
Yeah.
despite of. So what is the vision for the future?
Where am I headed?
Yeah.
To be honest, I used to be like a person that was always planning my next steps, especially things that were very predictable, like get this many credits, get this
Yeah.
degree,
Yeah.
apply to this job.
Mhm.
But I'm in an era now where I just feel like there's a lot less that's predictable
Okay.
about this journey.
Yeah.
And I'm also trying to take a step back and just really enjoy it. Right? I'm trying to get out of this, like, perpetual pursuit of what's next. I'm
Mm.
trying to get out of this hyper productivity, like, just produce more, just
Right.
put a check in
Right.
this box,
Yeah.
just keep racking up these accolades. And I wanna be honest, like, even the things that I've accomplished, it was never to be like,
I did
I
this.
did,
Right.
I
Yeah.
have all these books, I have like, it
Yeah.
was never about that for me.
Fair.
So what's next is, I think, continuing to be honest about what I want,
Absolutely.
be clear about what I don't want,
Yeah.
and also, like, quite honestly, like, leaving space for the manifestation of miracles.
Mhm.
And I know people like to say, what's for you is like, it's not gonna miss you. And I
Right.
really do kind of feel like that. Like,
Right.
all I can do is my work. And what it's supposed to do in the world, I think, is out of my control.
Right. It'll be led to wherever.
All I can do is be responsive to what's put on my spirit, create the works that are coming through me, and create the connections that feel like I'm supposed to do those things.
Right.
But outside of that, I'm not going to I'm not gonna stress myself out
On what
trying
is
to
supposed.
orchestrate every single thing,
Okay.
especially knowing that in some ways I have so little control
Ooh.
over that.
Okay.
So what's next is, I don't know, continuing to,
It's
like,
what's
move through the
next.
world
Exactly.
with wonder. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do.
I'm not mad at that. So I have two last questions,
Mhm.
and I always ask. So the first is, what advice would you give someone who has just experienced a tragic loss, or they're experiencing, like, what advice would you first give someone who, like, just got the news?
Um, I honestly think, and I know this probably sounds so simple, but it's like, you really have to take your time.
Mm, that's great advice. Yeah.
You have to really take your time and also be open to experiencing a range of emotions, because there's gonna be days when you think you should be in tears, but you may be filled with joy. There's gonna be days when you think you're supposed to have joy and nothing but sadness is taking over.
Right.
So you have to be like, take your time to move through this range of emotional experiences, because that's really what the existence is like, just
Right.
managing that on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
And refuse to let people dictate how you should feel.
That right there, that that's a word in of, and could also be its own episode. Like, that's a word in of itself.
Yes.
'Cause that, I think a lot of us struggle with that, regardless of what it is. And then my last question, my dear, and there you have given just, I mean, we went all over the place, but in the best of ways
Mhm.
of, like, all the things. I always, the last question is what advice would you give younger Julia?
Be patient.
Mm.
Like, be patient.
Okay. And that's it. Just be patient.
Be patient.
I'm not mad at that. All right. So for every episode, and I'm trying to collect my thoughts right now because there's so many things that I want to like touch on. I always do key takeaways at the end of every episode. So my key takeaways from today's conversation, and like I said, I'm still like grappling with all the things because there's so much that you should take away and adhere to. However, my first takeaway started at the very beginning, and it's something that I have to ensure to do. And the first is, even when you search for information or you look for what we believe to be credible this or that, like, context matters. Taking time to really dig deep and learn about something and learn more about the who, the whats, the whens, the whys in whatever subject makes a huge difference. Because if you don't do that, it can change a perception of whatever topic is. And so I feel like that was actually something that I took away from, like, actively in my own, like, providing of information and things of that nature. Like, context really does matter. So that was like the first takeaway. My second takeaway, and this is specific to the topic of conversation when we're just discussing grief and everything of that sort, is the idea of grief is not linear. And you need to understand that you cannot tick boxes off of how to manage or get quote unquote done with grief. And then that leans itself to my third key takeaway, which was the idea that you never heal from grief, you heal through grief. And the idea that for as long as the person is lost or the loss has happened, which is forever, you will forever also hold space for grief. And you should hold space. And the idea of healing should be a through all, a continuum of work. So there is no point of completion, but rather becoming more cognizant and understanding of what it is that one is going through. And then, is this going to be, I'll say my last, because I always do 4. So I'll say my last key takeaway, but there's so many. There's so many. But my last one was the advice you gave your younger self. And I think it's imperative in every aspect, not only when it comes to the concept of loss or just living in general, but be patient. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with others. Be patient with circumstance. Just allow yourself to be present. And as long as you do the work and you continue to show up, everything else will align itself, I'll say. So those are going to be my key takeaways from today's conversation. I could keep going. You provided me, like, I feel like this was actually a little cathartic and healing for myself. So I don't know why I didn't expect that, but I'm really I'm going through a lot of emotions right here, but in the best of ways. And so I always give flowers. Like, you have been extremely humble in your approach today that I've noticed. And while I understand, and you've said many times, like, you didn't do work because of or for, like, it's just been your journey. You're doing amazing work. I think that you bring a lot of value. I think that there is a lot of good. And this conversation is one that is not necessarily easy or comfortable is the right word, I think. But your approach and your presence and you are just like, I feel like love from, and you seem very like genuine. And I just wanted to share, like, I appreciate you, the work that you're doing. I own Black Mermaid, so I've read your body of work, and I cannot say enough. Like, thank you for your time. Thank you for your heart. continue. I can't wait to see what you accomplish as life continues. So yeah, just thank you.
Thank you, Lissette. Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. So as always, guys, sending light, sending love. Bye.